Hi, you're watching AniVerse English. This story is about a schoolboy who was bullied by everyone for his weak skills and mediocrity in school. He often needed to get enough sleep and slept in class, as he liked to play video games until late. His eyes opened and sparkled with joy. Emotions were overflowing. He had not experienced such happiness for a long time and thought this was real. Standing in front of the class with their hands raised in joy, everyone was surprised by such an act. Kazuro, that's the name of our main character, thought he had defeated a terrible monster and saved the world from destruction. Everyone praised him, rejoiced, and thanked him. He was pleased and glad that he had finally become a hero. Opening his eyes, he found himself in front of the class, not understanding what was happening. Everyone laughed at him. Kazuro's smile disappeared from his face, turning into horror as he realized it was all a dream. How ashamed and awkward he felt, having achieved everything he wanted all his life. But the world in which our hero lived was filled with monsters, and becoming a hero who would free humanity was his cherished dream. A long time ago, a war broke out on the planet with the monsters that came to our world. They callously killed people and destroyed cities one after another. The idea that this was the end of humanity felt real, but the monsters that invaded were extremely dangerous. However, they had one vulnerability. A person could absorb them, making them their weapon. This is how absorbers appeared in the world. Unfortunately, not everyone had this power. Absorbers were in great demand, and their power was our salvation from monsters. But the power of the absorber depended only on the monster it absorbed, and they were divided into three types. Those who could absorb the power of one monster, the so-called B rank, the most numerous A rank, who could absorb two monsters' powers, and S rank, who could absorb 3 or more monsters. Kazuro was an ordinary low-ranking guy. The thoughts in his head overwhelmed him as he stood in front of the class in confusion. The dream felt so real that it was hard to believe it wasn't. After this, he sat down and wanted to play his favorite game, where you have to kill ghosts, trying not to pay attention to the jokes and grins of his classmates. He again plunged into the game world. The teacher started yelling at Kazuro for behaving like this. Not only did he sleep in class, but he also sat on his phone, and his academic performance was poor. Today was the exam, after which it would be clear who would become the absorber. Our hero completely forgot that the exam was divided into theoretical and practical parts. On the theoretical side, everything was terrible, but on the practical side, this would determine our hero's fate. A chance to become a scavenger, or he would work tirelessly at a construction site until the end of his days. This gave Kazuro strength and confidence, realizing that hard labor on a construction site, pulling beams and operating heavy equipment, was not his thing. The teacher called our hero to refresh his knowledge and tell him how to properly absorb monsters and use their power. Kazuro began to get up from his desk slowly. Kazuro is a witty guy. Knowing how to absorb the powers of a monster is enough to find a way to irritate the monster so that it mindlessly attacks, revealing its vulnerabilities, or to attack unnoticed. But this is difficult and rarely feasible, as most monsters can smell a person a mile away. The class burst out laughing. The answer was not entirely correct. If you act this way, the risk of death is quite high. You need to act as a group, attack at the same time, and victory will most often go to the absorbers. The guys laughed at him, knowing how weak he was and how he could not cope with monsters alone. His deskmate and best friend, Per, also laughed and told the other classmates that the boy clearly didn't understand anything. The teacher was angry at the stupid answers. Monsters have many powers and can even control the elements of nature. These are extremely dangerous creatures, and you have to be careful. Kazuro didn't care much about the teacher's words. He wanted to quickly start working as an absorber and show everyone what he was really capable of. Answering the teacher's questions, he asked permission to charge his phone, thereby undermining the silence in the class and striking insolence. Kazuro behaved this way because he was always bored at school, and there were no useful subjects for him. The girls in the class laughed at our hero, thinking he was stupid. Kazuro had long been accustomed to this reaction. He just liked the smiles of beautiful girls. But there had never been a girl who could support him, one he could push against the wall and express all his feelings to, or at least a beautiful monster. True, his actions could only scare the girl away, and the chance would be missed. The thoughts of this slightly anxious teenager made him blush and did not please the teacher very much. Kazuro always liked to look at beautiful girls, but this was not always the case. He was modest in communicating with girls, and therefore most often heard refusals. From such thoughts, laughter echoed throughout the class. Only the teacher felt ashamed. Anger grew within her, barely restrained. She was already shaking from Kazuro's impudence, but she understood that the boy was only provoking her and wanted to leave the lesson. A hit on the table silenced everyone, and their breath caught in their lungs. Her gentle hand, in moments of anger, turned into a rather dangerous weapon. Getting hit on the head with such a hand would be painful. The teacher's eyes filled with anger. Emotions took precedence over reason. Kazuro knew that punishment would inevitably overtake him. He had not seen such a teacher for a long time. The previous time, he was also to blame for the stink bomb in the office. The teacher sends Kazo to the wall, hoping that he will come to his senses someday. The boy still manages to laugh it off and is just glad that he was allowed to be alone in the corner. The teacher was very upset by this behavior, and her head began to hurt. She begins to tell the children how the exam will be assessed and the options for where to take it. A grade can be obtained for completing the room corresponding to letter B in room B, C in room C, and D in room D. The children sat at their desks and listened carefully to the teacher. They wanted to pass the exam with flying colors and ensure a good life for themselves. Kazo also needed to listen to the material, so the teacher allowed him to sit down. Since our hero is lazy and weak, she advised him to choose the weakest room, D. Kazo, listening to the teacher's advice, walked to his desk and rubbed the back of his head with his hand, pretending that he agreed. The children turned on their holographic computers to select the room where they would take the exam. Difficult choices that would shape their future. Each student carefully read the description of each room with monsters to determine where to go and what they could handle with their strength. A classmate at his desk suggested going to room D together, to which Kazo responded with a categorical no. He decided long ago to go through room A to prove to himself and others that he is strong. Pa laughed and advised him to stop joking and do as the teacher said. Without thinking for long, Kazo pressed a button on the screen to start the exam in room A. This choice would entail many tests and show his future development toward working in the Absorber Bureau. A teleporter began to activate on the screen to transport Kazo to the testing area. Advanced technology mixed with magic made this possible. Kazo began to feel how his body was gradually being sucked into the monitor screen. The neighbor at the desk was shocked by what was happening since a weak absorber could not survive in Zone A. He started shouting to the teacher to pull him out and not let him in. Pa was very scared for his friend and thought that he would not return alive. The teacher started shouting for Kazo to stop. Otherwise, he might die. This was too dangerous for a student of his level. All the children were surprised at how crazy the act was, but he had decided long ago and was not going to give up. Everyone in the class looked on in surprise as Kazo was pulled into the teleport of Zone A, a room where monsters lived, much more dangerous than in the video game. The rest of the children could not even think of going to this zone because they understood that they were too weak. The teacher, seeing how Kazo was pulled into Zone A, got scared and realized that the exam would not be possible without sacrifices. Our hero and the other school children found themselves in an old, abandoned place infested with monsters. Determination was visible in their eyes as they stood and waited to be brought up to date and told where to go. There was a dark forest and a dark sky all around. Kazo still had the same company, the school's favorite and main star, Suki, with her minions and 2 classmates. They looked at our hero with great contempt. These were students from another class, and they knew each other. The bespectacled boy always insulted Kazo for being a weakling who could not even summon a monster. He stood behind Suki and adjusted the frame of his glasses on his face. Suddenly, a strange ghost appeared above his classmates, its red eyes and pale skin making for a chilling sight. For the first time, they saw a ghost in person. The girl felt something appear behind her and began to tremble with fear. Her lips curled and trembled. The boys were scared and alarmed by the appearance of the monster at the start of the exam. The girl immediately climbed into the arms of her classmate, who always loved her. The boy did not immediately understand what had happened as the girl pressed hard and almost knocked him down. Kazo did not show fear. He saw a harmless ghost in front of him, though the others were scared. He looked on with suspicion, ready to begin the exam and show what he was capable of. This ghost turned out to be an examiner and would conduct the exam under the rule that they would have to survive for a day in an old abandoned hospital and absorb the powers of at least one monster. The ghost looked like an ancient monk who helped people. Crows flew around, creating an eerie atmosphere. Having learned that they had to stay in a hospital full of monsters for 24 hours, the children were frightened, believing they would definitely not survive. To be protected at night, they had to capture the monster's powers before midnight to get into the safe zone. The examiner assured the children that if they were in danger and could not cope, everyone was given a scroll that would take them back to class. If they could kill the goblins and take their bead, they would receive a reward. Scrolls provided the ability to transfer, but not protection. If lost or damaged, they would not be able to get out of there. The exam started now, 2 hours left until midnight. Our group stood in front of the huge arch of the hospital with monsters, in fear and anticipation of something that would change their lives. A long, tall staircase led to the main entrance, and the decorative arches and decorations on the pillars were quite old. Even in front of such a terrible place, they looked at Kazo and did not understand why he had come here. He had no chance. Everyone was sure of his imminent death and told him to get out. The bespectacled boy stood behind, a little scared in this creepy place. Kazo stood in front of the entrance and decided to go first to find a monster for himself as quickly as possible and test his skills. The guys behind saw that he went first, so they decided not to split up yet and to follow him. The crows only frightened the children with their cries, forcing them to go inside. Upon entering the hospital, there were pools of blood everywhere, a disgusting smell, and frightening sounds. Looking at all this, there were fewer and fewer good thoughts, so they stayed together. Kazo and the rest of the students walked down the hospital corridor, with blood all around. Fear crept into their hearts even more, but Kazo could not be overcome by this. Being at the front, our hero wanted to play a trick on his classmates by devising an insidious plan to scare them. Looking around the corridors of the hospital and seeing several paintings on the wall with portraits of the chief physician and director, he thought that making a joke might not have been appropriate, but it would dilute the already tense situation. Pretending that there was a crowd of monsters in front of him, he signaled to the others to stop. Kazo began to slowly move back, showing with all his appearance that he was scared. His steps were very careful and slow. He asked everyone not to make noise. He said that there was a huge fanged monster with a large mouth and a long tail devouring a man, and around it was a crowd of small orcs grinning their teeth. So, Yuki and his comrades got a little scared and began to show that they were frightened. Kazo began to scream in fear and run as fast as he could, setting an example for the others to scare them more. His scream was loud enough to wake the monsters, so the guys had no choice but to run away from there and back to the exit. The children rushed along the blood-stained corridor toward the exit, trying not to turn around. The fear in their eyes gave them the strength to run faster and hope for survival. Once outside, the students fell exhausted to the ground, knowing that the monsters did not leave the exam area. They could relax. They tried to catch their breath and calm down, but suddenly, after they came to their senses, they noticed that Kazo was not with them. The thought was that he did not have time and had been grabbed before leaving. Suddenly, loud laughter was heard from the balcony of the hospital. The guys raised their heads to see who was laughing so hard and saw him. Kazo, standing and applauding his cowardly classmates for the first time. He mocked them, saying, "We bought it." He clapped his hands and said that now it was clear who the bespectacled coward was. The guys were terribly unhappy with this action and began shouting at him in irritated voices. They were ashamed that a weakling had humiliated them, especially the main beauty of the school. The bespectacled boy, unable to find words, told Kazo everything he was thinking and said what he would get for it. The beauty was upset at how she was set up and made to feel afraid because she was the strongest among them. Her skill level was greater than the others. The henchman began to tell Kazo what a brute and scum he was. Keijo looked at their frightened faces. He felt relaxed and showed no fear. His confidence in his abilities was high, but his classmates' statements slightly shamed him. The beauty, proudly raising her head, said that she was not afraid but simply followed the others, adding that in case of danger, she would save them. The henchmen were touched by her words and were sure she would have saved them. She was from an influential family and meant a lot to them. Keijo, listening to all this nonsense, simply turned around and left in search of monsters to absorb and defeat. While they were on the street, he had a better chance of finding someone first. Yuki and the others were very unhappy that they were being ignored and were not going to leave it like that. Going down to the first floor, Keijo began to explore the offices in search of monsters and came across an ophthalmologist's office from where strange sounds were coming. "Here it is," Keijo exclaimed joyfully. Suddenly, the same group entered the corridor, praising their queen, and began to say that he should not interfere with them. If he saw or heard anything, he should tell them, and the beauty would sort it out. Keijo was already fed up with their arrogance, and knowing that there was a monster in the office, an insidious plan matured in his head to teach the upstarts a lesson. If they were so strong, then it would not be difficult for them to defeat the monster. Politely letting them into the office, he asked forgiveness from the beauty for their behavior, allowing them to be the first to fight the monster in this office. Fortunately, there were enough monsters in the hospital. Entering the office, they saw a strange creature sitting on a chandelier fan, and they were seriously scared. Their mouths were wide open, wanting to scream, but they understood that they would then be noticed and could be killed. This monster possessed the magic of illusions and made them feel their worst nightmares. He used his skill, and a red light sparkled on the dark ceiling, shocking the children and making them stand in a stupor, staring into the big red void. The trio froze in a trembling stupor, succumbing to hypnosis. Kazuro watched from the side, not knowing the full danger, thinking that they would cope and just waiting. At first, he didn't understand why the others froze and began to cower in fear. Seeing the trembling beauty, Suzuki, leaving the office, Kazuro turned pale. He was scared, thinking he had set them up by falling into the clutches of a very strong monster that none of them could handle. "Are you okay?" he asked, to which the girl told him what the monster was capable of, how it mocked them and forced them to plunge into their darkest nightmares. But it didn't last long, and they managed to escape. Afterwards, they decided that Keijo had set them up and that he knew about the monster but didn't warn them. It turned out he used them to find out the monster's weak point and defeat it. The beauty and her company were terribly angry, insisting that he had no chance anyway. Kazuro, realizing that the target was weak, concluded that the monster was not strong enough to kill them, which meant defeating it wouldn't be difficult. He just needed to be more cunning. This infuriated the others even more, that he considered them unreasonable. Seeing that the irritated group was leaving the corridor in search of other monsters, Kazuro began to devise a plan to catch the monster in the ophthalmology office and absorb its power. The ability to freeze with fear would give him a great advantage over his enemies. Spotting a switch on the wall, he came up with the great idea of spinning the monster on the chandelier fan, thereby stunning it. Keijo pressed the button and waited for the show. Seeing the monster spinning on the fan and screaming, Keijo stood in anticipation of defeating it. Hearing from Suki that the monster had hypnosis, Keijo didn't look at it and closed his eyes. The monster began to beg him to stop, promising to give him power. Kazuro was smart enough to know that monsters couldn't be trusted, but he pretended to believe it to buy time. Keijo turned off the fan, expecting the monster to attack him, but it turned out that from spinning, the monster's eye had dried out, and it could no longer use hypnosis. The monster pleaded for eye drops from the cabinet because its voice had dried out a lot. Now, if Keijo wanted to survive, he had to do as the monster said. Otherwise, the red eye would attack and tear him into small pieces. For now, Keijo agreed, thinking of another plan to defeat such a monster. He didn't take his eyes off this scarecrow hanging on the chandelier as he began to walk toward the medicine cabinet and tried to open it. Seeing that the cabinet contained various medicines and potions, as well as medical alcohol, Kazuro immediately understood what he had to do. He carefully wiped the label off the bottle, throwing it to the monster without revealing his intentions. He began to wait for a reaction to attack at the right moment. He didn't want to be hypnotized and stood with his back to the monster, waiting for it to use the drops. The monster, smiling creepily, was already imagining how it would deal with Kazo after he dropped his voice. Opening the bottle, it brought it to its eye and dribbled the drops in. Kazo had never heard such cries of pain before. Smiling sarcastically and watching the monster through the reflection on the glass door of the locker, he realized this was the right time to attack. Gathering his power, he cast the absorption spell, glad that everything was going so easily. Kazo was excited about how absorbing the monster would affect him. The monster began to turn into a red mist of mana that rushed into Kazuro's body. Realizing he would strengthen his abilities, he was ready to find out what this monster was capable of. Having absorbed the monster, Kazuro saw in the mirror how it was imprinted on his body. It was a red eye. Now he could stop enemies and weaken their abilities. This ability was still very weak, but it could be upgraded. As he left the office, he began to notice that the red eye allowed him to see other monsters nearby, despite the obstacles. The corridor was stained with blood, and a light fog rose from the monster's abilities, hiding them. Indeed, the ability of the bloody eye was amazing. It gave Kazuro confidence because now he could control where the monsters were and was no longer afraid of an accidental collision. Meanwhile, the beautiful Suki and her henchmen came across several goblins. The beauty was not taken aback and hit one, realizing there were more enemies and she might not be able to cope. They decided to run away, sprinting along the corridor as fast as they could, trying to escape and find a place where they could fight off the damned creatures. The bespectacled boy screamed the loudest, not wanting to die, while his friend was also very scared and hoped that Suki would protect them. On the landing, walking down, Kazo immediately thought of distracting the goblins so the group could escape. Seeing Kazo, the guys immediately said it was his turn to take on the enemy, reminding him that if he couldn't handle it, he should use the teleportation scroll. Seeing the crowd of approaching goblins, Kazo felt a surge of happiness as he remembered the examiner saying that their beads were very valuable. Finally, the time had come to use the bloody eye for its intended purpose and get rich. Kazo noted that the bloody eye acted on monsters a bit differently. It simply fettered them, preventing movement. Kazuro, having previously obtained a chainsaw from one of the offices, began to mercilessly destroy the goblins, driven by the good reward they promised. Holding the green goblin stones in his hands, he imagined what he could spin them on. What fun things to do and the food he had long wanted to try. Wandering through the corridors, all the ghosts and monsters fled from Kazo. His abilities frightened everyone and made them run without looking back, but it was all in vain. Kazuro killed them without a twinge of conscience, hoping to profit from something valuable. Continuing down the corridor in search of a worthy opponent, he stumbled upon a surgery room from which a strange glow and music could be heard. Inside sat a beautiful maiden with ample breasts and long black hair, dressed in a kimono, with a white strap visible on her belt. Kazuro and the devoured monster immediately blushed upon seeing her beauty, as bad thoughts entered their heads. She sat in the office, playing the zither. The melody was pleasant yet bewitching. The skills of this beautiful monster fascinated and frightened him at the same time. Who knew what she was capable of? Kazuro wondered what such a beauty was doing in the operating room and how strong she was. He sensed danger from her but couldn't gauge how much. Kazo began to think about how to defeat her and absorb her power. Several ideas crossed his mind, but the red voice dissuaded him from approaching, knowing she was dangerous. Kazo then speculated that she was not merely in the operating room, but that she might have died during an operation, and this place was holding her captive. Plucking up his courage, he noticed the doctor's coat and an idea came to him. Armed with a syringe, he decided to pretend to be a doctor. If she wanted to attack, the red voice would grab her, but it warned him that she was too strong and that this plan wouldn't work. Opening the door, Kazuro looked at the girl playing the musical instrument, afraid to take the wrong step. Hearing the noise, the beauty immediately exclaimed in a menacing voice, unhappy at being interrupted. She quickly used a musical impulse with her magic to stun her enemy. Kazuro felt the power of the beautiful maiden's zither, The pain in his ears was severe and rendered him immobile. Falling to his knees, Kazuro was confused and thought he could die in a skirmish with such a monster. Introducing himself as a doctor, he hoped it would help. Her gloomy face showed distrust and anger. The desire to kill was evident. Kazuro began to say he was a professional surgeon who could help her. Trying not to show his incompetence, he started to clean up the workplace, asking the girl to trust him. Having convinced her to lie down, Kazuro took out the syringe and asked what was bothering her that required an operation. He blushed while looking at her beautiful form, but her words surprised him even more when she requested a breast reduction. Life had not prepared him for this. Making a serious face, Kazuro asked her to relax so he could give her an injection. Her skin was so tough that the syringe resisted entering. Without revealing his struggle, he pretended to inject multiple times, insisting he hadn't hit the vein. Through tears, the girl began to scream that enough was enough and asked him to get ready. Otherwise, she would kill him. Kazuro claimed her skin was too strong and that the needles wouldn't take it. They could try something better if she agreed to go without anesthesia. As Kazuro attempted to inject the beauty, his classmates passing by heard voices and decided to investigate. Surprise was visible on their faces as they admired how fearlessly Kazo spoke to the monster, seeing him grow in their eyes and making them think he was not as weak as he seemed. All this time, Kazuro was being watched by an examiner, a ghost. The ability to fly and remain hidden allowed them to evaluate the children's actions fairly and impartially. However, Kazuro's actions made the examiner wonder how confident he was in the face of danger and how he assessed the situation correctly. After many attempts to inject the busty girl, she finally gave the go-ahead for the operation without anesthesia but asked him to be more gentle, unlike the girl in front of her. Taking out a chainsaw, Kazuro didn't want to spoil such beauty and tried to dissuade her. He started the chainsaw, the sound of which infuriated the beauty, leading her to ask questions like how long it would take to cut and whether they should be the same size or if one should be larger than the other. Kazuro knew that to devour a monster, he had to make her angry. In his mind, he tried to come up with more caustic words to achieve his goal and absorb her power. Kazuro reminded her that without anesthesia, it would be very painful, so she would have to endure it. After so much bullying and stupid questions, the girl became very angry, starting to scream and threaten Kazo. Taking her zither in hand, she wanted to use her strongest spell to kill Kazuro. The monster's aura was very strong, but her irritation had reached a limit, making it easy for Kazuro to absorb its abilities using his power. Kazo took great pleasure in casting absorption spells. The busty beauty watched in surprise as her strength proved useless against Kazuro, and the attack played a cruel joke on her. The monster's power was absorbed, and the screams coming from the office echoed throughout the entire hospital. A monster of this power should grant amazing skills, the guy thought. The skills were successfully absorbed, and Kazo now had 2 monsters with super abilities. Now, all that remained was to gain enough trust from them to team up in battles. With newfound confidence and a thirst for more, he believed he could defeat anyone by giving them orders. The busty beauty began to shout at him, insisting she wouldn't tolerate being controlled. Kazuro assured her he had something else in mind. He wasn't going to boss her around. He wanted to befriend them to defeat his enemies and would never push around someone with virtues like hers. "You can stop anyone," he said. The beauty was dissatisfied with his crude jokes and confronted him about his depraved thoughts, to which he replied that she had misunderstood. It just so happened that the skill of the red eye fettered the enemy, but the enemy's mind remained clear. This didn't guarantee 100% confidence in maintaining control for long, putting him at risk. With the beauty's skills, their brains were exposed to fear, making it impossible to think sensibly. Together with the bloody eye, they could immobilize the enemy confidently and for an extended period. Hearing the hospital speakers announce that there was less than an hour left until midnight, the voice suggested that those who had absorbed monsters should go to a safe zone to rest and regain strength. Upon hearing this proposal, Kazo headed there with his 2 monsters, overwhelmed by the desire to prove his classmates wrong. The school beauty and her friends, realizing time was short, headed to the safe zone as well. They arrived first, upset by the dirty and cold room intended for those who had absorbed the power of one monster. While the trio complained about the lack of comfort, their classmates approached the entrance. The girl felt upset by her cowardice for not having absorbed a single monster. Kazo tried to calm her down, telling her not to worry. Kazuro approached them confidently, pleased with his victories. Entering the room, he encountered a crowd that continued to tease him, but Kazo didn't care anymore because he knew what was cooler. Kazuro ignored their banter and complaints about not wanting to share the same room with him, reassuring them that he was different and was going to a VIP chamber. The guys were surprised by this decision and didn't believe it, thinking Kazuro was deceiving them and that the system wouldn't let him in. Yet doubt lingered. Maybe he could still do it. Approaching the protective barrier of the VIP chamber, Kazuro extended his hand to open it, enjoying the reward of being a worthy client. The reaction was immediate. Everyone was incredibly surprised by this turn of events. They thought he was cheating and unfairly gaining access to the VIP chamber. Anger consumed them, and their emotions ran high, only intensified by Kazuro's grin as he entered the room. Inside, Kazo found a plate of hot food and a pleasant atmosphere. The room was warm, and the delightful aroma drove him wild. The camping stove showcased a delicious dish of fish and vegetables, and after tasting the tender fish, he closed his eyes in admiration, savoring every bite. Appreciating this exquisite dish, he approached the barrier behind which stood the school's main beauty with her henchmen, eager to tease them. They couldn't enter, and their anger grew as they watched Kazuro devour the fish with great appetite, enjoying the comfort. The arrogance of the school beauty wouldn't allow her to spend the night in a room without amenities. She wanted access to the VIP room and was ready to negotiate. While Kazuro indulged in his delicious meal, the trio disturbed him, eager to buy his right to stay or negotiate for a fee. Kazuro, looking at their angry and arrogant faces, refused, determined to teach them a lesson regardless of the offer. His classmates persisted, offering him a lot of money to give up his spot. Unexpectedly, the girl reminded him that she came from a rich and influential family, implying he wouldn't be safe with such behavior. Setting his chopsticks aside, Kazuro looked at them, thinking he hadn't taught them a sufficient lesson yet. If they continued to behave this way, the threats were unnecessary. Approaching them closer, Kazuro offered to fulfill his wish if they wanted to get into his apartment. The influential beauty received an interesting proposal. If she slapped her bespectacled partner, he would consider switching places with them. She immediately agreed, surprising the guy. A classmate quickly calmed him down, promising to compensate for the blow, reminding him that her family was influential and would help him. Preparing for the strike, the girl swung with all her might and hit him in the face, nearly knocking off his glasses. The force of the blow sent him reeling back, leaving him confused. "Well, I'm happy," the girl said. "Now will you give us your place?" Kazuro, unimpressed, changed his mind, saying it was a great effort but still not enough. He turned around joyfully, deciding to return to the table and continue his meal. Realizing Kazo wouldn't give them his spot, they turned around, upset, and left. Glad to be rid of them, Kazo continued to enjoy the hot food against the backdrop of their screams. Another quarrel among classmates flared up. Unfortunately, not everyone was able to absorb a monster's power. Those who couldn't do so before midnight were prohibited from entering the safe zone. The girl was very afraid of being alone and asked her classmate to stay with her. Kazuro recognized the couple. The guy was infatuated with her, often running after her in school and helping her with everything. The girl, knowing her classmate had feelings for her, cleverly used a kiss to achieve her goal. She was confident he would give in and relinquish his spot. Watching this unfold, Kazo felt sorry for the guy, realizing she was taking advantage of him. After that first kiss from the girl he loved, he immediately agreed to everything and gave up his place. Now, she was safe, and he remained by the entrance, waiting for dawn. Kazuro was very tired from all the scandals and quarrels, so he lay down in a warm bed and quickly fell asleep. His snoring was so loud that it prevented anyone else from sleeping. Frustrated by the cacophony, the others couldn't find rest. They were exhausted and, looking at the beds, doubted they could sleep at all, especially with Kazuro's terrible snoring driving them mad. The thought of how despicable Kazuro was lingered in their minds as they sought a cleaner place to rest. Meanwhile, the influential girl dreamed of the morning, planning to teach the nasty Kazuro a lesson to prove she was the strongest and most gifted. As she looked at the blood-stained bed, she couldn't understand how anyone could sleep there. The bespectacled boy, wanting to please his beautiful classmate, offered to lay down his shirt so the bed wouldn't get dirty. Unfortunately, it was impossible to remove the smell of blood. While placing his shirt on the bed didn't clean it, at least it provided a somewhat cleaner spot to lie down. While everyone else tried to sleep and rest, the lovesick boy who had sacrificed his place for his beloved sat near the safe zone, glancing at his watch. Suddenly, he heard a noise coming from the dark corridor, ominous growling that sent goosebumps of fear running through his body. Approaching cautiously, he saw an entity towering 2 meters tall with blood-red eyes. The classmate took a defensive stance, ready for battle. The appearance of this monster resembled something from a horror film. It wore a mask tied with ropes, revealing a bloody face that struck terror into everyone. The boy was terrified, his body trembling and cold sweat beading on his forehead, his eyes twitching in fear. Gathering his courage, he called on his absorbed monster for help. The devoured monster was an axe-wielding warrior, a formidable opponent, who saw the frightened boy but didn't yet know what lay ahead. Unexpectedly, the warrior was attacked by a huge maniac wielding a chainsaw. The sight was so intimidating that the axe warrior doubted he could survive the fight. Just managing to block a crushing blow from the chainsaw, sparks flew in all directions from the impact's force. Hearing the commotion behind the barrier, everyone woke up and jumped out of their beds, even Kazo, who came to see what was happening. Everyone was scared, except for him. The others shouted to the girl that her boyfriend was being attacked by a monster with a chainsaw and was fighting for his life. The girl, trembling, didn't utter a word, instead diving under the blanket, cowardly, afraid only for herself. Her indifference shocked everyone. Her boyfriend was battling a monster, yet she didn't care. Each classmate looked at her with contempt for her lack of concern. Kazuro, confident in himself, decided to assess the situation and see how formidable the monster was, wondering if it was worthy of being devoured. Meanwhile, the chainsaw-wielding monster knocked the axe warrior to the ground and began to trample him. Everything happened so quickly that the onlookers barely had time to process it. The blows were powerful, and it was clear that the axe warrior was losing. In this duel, his chances were dwindling as he found himself pinned to the ground. A monster with a chainsaw tore off the warrior's arm, its foot pressing down on his head, squeezing until pain erupted from the loss of his hand. The monster, a cannibal, greedily devoured the warrior's hand, desperately seeking sustenance. Such a creature was incredibly difficult to defeat. Its mask obscured its true identity, while its tattered clothes hinted at a long existence in this place. Having sampled the taste of warrior flesh, it was unsatisfied and discarded the remnants, evidently repulsed by its own kind. Enraged and hungry, it continued its assault, determined to kill the warrior. The fury born of hunger was palpable and terrifying. Gripping the chainsaw tightly, it revved the engine, causing the sharp chain to whirl menacingly. With another strike, the warrior's head was severed, fear and despair visible in his eyes. The battle was one-sided, and escape was impossible. This was his final fight. The head, now lying at the feet of the cannibal, signaled the warrior's defeat. Kazuro, witnessing the monster's strength, realized it would be a valuable addition to his collection. Such power could tip the scales in any battle. Kazuro, intrigued yet dissatisfied, contemplated what he needed for the fight ahead, knowing an attacking monster would serve him well. The creatures Kazuro had absorbed previously only had a stunning effect. None were warriors. Collecting this trinity would allow him to face any opponent with ease. Meanwhile, the cannibal cornered another classmate, eager to taste fresh flesh. The roar of the chainsaw was maddening, instilling deep fear. In terror, the boy screamed for help, thoughts of his impending doom racing through his mind. His classmates, paralyzed with fear, yelled at his girlfriend, urging her to act, but she was too afraid to intervene, trembling under her blanket and admitting her fear. Kazuro was appalled by her betrayal. Such a display of love was revolting. While others cowered behind barriers, the boy, in tears, begged for salvation. Kazuro's eyes brimmed with tears of despair as the monster swung its chainsaw, attempting to slice the boy, craving the taste of fresh, young flesh. Despite his fear, the boy dodged, trying to reach the barrier by slipping beneath the enormous creature. Unfortunately, the cannibal was quick and landed a devastating blow, striking the boy in the stomach. The impact sent him flying, leaving him gasping in agony, blood spilling from his mouth. He had never felt such pain, and hope dwindled with every moment spent confronting this formidable foe. Reeling from the blow, he crashed into the wall, on the verge of losing consciousness, his body racked with fractures and pain. The sounds of his agony echoed down the corridor as the monster approached, chainsaw screaming, ready to finish him off. The creature regarded him like a piece of meat, devoid of pity, its sharp chain eager to shred his flesh. In a moment of clarity amidst the chaos, the boy felt a sharp pain in his shoulder as the chain dug into him, tearing his skin. He screamed in agony, watching as the monster's blood-soaked hand gripped his severed flesh. Darkness enveloped him as he lost consciousness. With a sickening crunch, the monster devoured the boy's hand, lamenting its long absence from human flesh. As horror coursed through Kazuro's body, the boy regained consciousness and saw the monster feasting on his severed hand. Remembering the examiner's words about salvation scrolls, he stealthily reached into his pocket, hoping not to attract the monster's attention. He pulled out a scroll from the inner pocket of his jacket, intending to use it swiftly to save himself. Realizing he had failed the exam, he noted the scroll glowing brightly, a beacon that would surely attract the monster. Upon finishing its meal, the cannibal turned, drawn by the light, its desire for fresh flesh overwhelming. The boy summoned his remaining strength to leap aside, narrowly escaping the monster's attack as debris flew. Kazuro shouted to his classmate to tear the scroll quickly or face certain death. Calmly observing the scene, he remained uninvolved, leading the boy to gather his thoughts. Overwhelmed by fear, he struggled to think clearly, but Kazuro's words reignited his determination. Kneeling, he bit down on the scroll, tearing it open. While the monster swings his chainsaw in anticipation of the final, victorious blow, you tear the scroll with your teeth, releasing a huge surge of teleportation back to the classroom. She acts quickly and can save anyone in a difficult situation. The boy is saved. The chainsaw blow does not catch the magic of the scroll, and the monster remains a beggar. A sharp saw chain flies through the boy's already disappeared head. The monster is very confused and does not understand what has happened. He screams out of anger, not knowing where his prey is gone. He wants more meat and thirsts for blood. His body expresses tension and readiness for aggressive action. Kazuro waits for the right moment to fight the monster, knowing his power can absorb it when it is as enraged as possible. Plus, he must devise a plan to defeat such a thug. Looking at the boy, the monster begins to shred the barrier, but it does not give in. Anger overwhelms him, but this is not enough for Kazuro. The big, angry monster has been trying to cut through the protective barrier for a long time and does not want to give up. Kazuro pretends that the monster isn't trying hard, yawning and showing complete calmness, making it clear that the monster's strength does not impress anyone and does not cause fear. This irritates the monster even more. Kazuro then comes up with the idea of teasing the cannibal with his delicious hand, thereby angering it further. The boy provokes the monster by saying his hand is so tasty and full of protein that the taste is just lickable. The monster, drooling, looks at the hand, drawn in by the pleasant, young smell of flesh. Hunger controls him, giving him no rest. The monster cannot break through the barrier and begins to realize this. His face cannot tear itself away from the sight of the nice, fresh meat he loves so much. Kazuro teases the monster more, causing it to boil with rage. Abruptly, he removes his hand and begins to make faces, sticking out his tongue and fooling around with all his might. This brazen behavior infuriates the monster, which unleashes a hail of its strongest blows on the barrier, exuding anger and loud screams as the chainsaw chain hits the barrier in the hope of reaching this wretch and devouring him. After such an attempt, the monster decides to retreat, realizing it is wasting energy in vain. Kazuro notices the monster can leave and is unhappy with this situation. He activates the barrier to prevent the monster from escaping. Otherwise, it could harm someone else. Collecting himself, Kazuro steps out, showing the monster that he is no longer in the protection zone and can be attacked. The monster pays attention to the boy, wanting to kill and devour him. Turning around, it rushes toward Kazuro, hunger and anger taking control. Drool, like that of a dog, drips at high speed. Kazuro decides to have fun, realizing he should not show his strength to his classmates. He begins to buy time by mocking the monster, which cannot keep up with him and slams against the barrier. The children are amazed at Kazuro's reckless behavior but do not interfere. Once again, the monster leaves as a beggar, screaming in irritation. This is not enough for Kazuro. He goes out again to provoke the monster. He sees the beast come out and taunt it. Kazuro will not back down and will continue to bully the monster until he wins, hoping it will give up. This time he runs even faster, screaming as the crazy roar of the chainsaw echoes, trying to sever the damned head of the impudent boy, but again, he does not have time. Kazuro stands in front of the barrier, laughing in the face of the huge monster. His classmates are at a loss as to whether he is brave or foolish, and they tease the monster. Suki, watching Kazuro's risky actions, feels a bit worried and does not understand why he would do this to a monster. A classmate in a blue jacket with blonde hair is very surprised to see the monster beginning to run away. The bespectacled boy, hearing his comrade's words, also looks on, stunned that Kazuro is running after it. The guys are so surprised that they do not comprehend what is happening or how Kazuro could so fearlessly pursue such a huge and evil monster that had nearly killed their classmate. Chasing the monster down the corridor, Kazuro tries with all sorts of screams to stop it and fight to absorb such a big guy, but the monster is already very exhausted by Kazuro's pathetic jokes and antics. As Kazuro catches up, he begins to provoke the monster with his hand, saying how tasty and juicy it is. The monster is very surprised by these actions. No one has ever chased it down and offered to be devoured. Looking at the boy's hand, hunger speaks in the monster's mind, and it attempts to attack him. A tasty, juicy hand looms in front of its face, beckoning with its mere appearance. Launching its chainsaw, the monster swings without a shadow of a doubt to kill this slippery provocateur and devour him. The strong swing of a large chainsaw, with sharp teeth on a chain, is already aimed at the boy's head. Having time to react, Kazuro uses the magic of the red eye to stop the monster. Such a spell is enough for such a thug, but not for long. The ability is useful, allowing him to control and prevent himself from being attacked. It worked, Keijo exclaimed. Looking at the frozen body of the monster, he began to insult it, claiming it was weak and could do nothing. Kazuro's arrogance gave him the confidence to take a closer look at the monster without fear. Motionless, the creature choked on saliva while eyeing the delicious boy it longed to kill and devour. Kazuro's provocations did not cease. He kept flaunting his delectable hands, boasting about how delicious he was. Freed from the stupor spell, the monster immediately attacked, but Kazuro dodged as if nothing had happened. The strong impact of the saw began to cut through the hospital floor, sending sparks flying in all directions. The monster was already in the aisle, and absorbing a bit more would lower its defenses, making it easy prey for Kazuro. Rage burned within the creature, and it wanted to tear the insolent boy into pieces. A look exuding maximum hatred and anger tensed its entire body. This was the limit of its emotional protection. Now Keijo could attack. With a slight smirk on his face, he cast an absorption spell. Soon, he would have a formidable warrior in his arsenal. He began to absorb the monster and all its abilities. In bewilderment, the monster screamed, failing to comprehend how it had been defeated, showing its dissatisfaction that this should not have happened. Finally, the boy had an attacking monster displayed as a chainsaw on his arm. The collection has been replenished, Kazuro said, glancing at his left hand, reveling in the new sign of the monster that would serve him. The examiner watched everything unfold, confident that this was the new lord of the monsters. Although the boy's actions were questionable, there was almost no doubt. Through the hospital windows, he observed every action of the test participants. The examiner saw great potential in the boy and noted how he handled such a formidable opponent, which raised many questions. His thoughtful expression suggested that the boy possessed abilities that would help him achieve high results in life. The speakers in the safe zone announced that 7 hours remained before dawn, and the students prepared to continue the exam. The speaker utilized the examiner's magical abilities and required no electricity, which the hospital lacked. The children panicked, fearing that the monster Kazuro had pursued could be lurking nearby. They were certain that Kazo had already fled after tearing up the teleportation scroll because he couldn't defeat such a creature. Kazo entered the room with his hands in his pockets, exuding calm and confidence. His classmates looked at him with many questions, but did not believe he could absorb such a large monster with weak indicators. Kazuro claimed that the monster with the chainsaw was no longer a threat, and if they wished to complete the exam, they should seek other monsters. His classmates, with surprised and angry faces, refused to believe that such a bastard could win. They speculated that the monster had simply fled and that Kazuro had failed to find it, thinking he might set them up again. Despite their insults, Kazo contemplated how the absorbed abilities of monsters could elevate him among the leaders of the Devourers. Remembering that absorbers had their own hierarchy of strength and class, he envisioned himself at the top of the food chain, commanding everyone. After much thought, he grew tired, having slept little, and chasing the monster had exhausted him. Without hesitation, he plopped onto the bed with a comfortable mattress, trying to sleep. The warm room enveloped him, and the smell of food brought comfort. As dawn broke, sunlight filtered through the dusty windows. The street outside was calm and quiet, and large houses appeared nearby, making the place seem less abandoned. Leaving the VIP room, Kazuro had breakfast of warm toast cooked on a magic tile that prepared itself. In a good mood, he noticed his classmates emerging from the safe zone, looking tired and hungry. Suzuki held her stomach, longing for hot food and warm tea, but Kazuro, wanting to avoid being entangled with Kazo, decided to offer them his toast as a gesture of reconciliation. If they didn't eat, they would have little chance against monsters without powers. This only infuriated the principled Suki and the bespectacled boy, though their friend seemed interested, even if he knew it was low to agree to such a thing, to befriend trash. Kazo smiled at their reactions and continued finishing his toast. The traitor to her boyfriend finally woke up, drawing contemptuous glances from everyone. She yawned loudly, attracting attention. Kazo stood near her bed, pausing his chewing upon noticing everyone's stares. Feeling guilty under their condemning glances, she refused to show it. Kazo and the others regarded her with complete disgust for her actions. Kazuro remarked that she had taken advantage of the guy's feelings, which he had paid for, and she, in turn, hadn't even helped him. Hearing Kazuro's words, the girl grew angry, claiming she hadn't absorbed the monster and couldn't have helped him in any way. "You should have helped him," she exclaimed. Kazuro began to shout at her, accusing her of abandoning him to fate and insisting they should have helped him. The monster that attacked was weak, and while they didn't know how to save him, they weren't obligated to. He had survived but failed the exam, outnumbered by his competitors. Kazo noticed the girl's gaze, filled with fear and disappointment in herself, overwhelmed by emotions and anger toward those who blamed her and didn't stand up for her. The examiner had been watching the entire time, unable to interfere. He needed to inform the students about the final test and conclude the exam. A voice from the speakers interrupted the tension, announcing that the upcoming test was to capture or destroy a dangerous monster by noon. The trio of our heroes and their main rivals began discussing a plan to catch the creature. They needed to gather their strength and pass the test. Suzuki decided to take action, urging her comrades to stay alert. Not everyone agreed with her, as the monster they were supposed to capture or kill was of the highest level, while the monsters they had absorbed were only average. There was little chance of success. Suzuki reassured her friends, saying that there were 3 of them and they could manage such a monster. Hearing that everyone was making plans to capture the creature without offering her help terrified her. She realized she would be alone. Suddenly, a monster with a long tongue and glowing eyes appeared on the ceiling behind her. The girl, overwhelmed with worry about being unsupported, didn't initially feel threatened. Kazuro tensed, alarmed by the creature's sudden presence. Fear momentarily consumed him, while the others remained oblivious. The monster resembled a grotesque hybrid of a man and a spider, with huge claws and 6 glowing eyes. It could silently climb walls and ceilings, and its sharp spikes looked deadly. Kazuro was even more surprised to find that only he could see this monster. The others were calm, indicating they hadn't noticed its massive presence. Remembering that one of the skills of the Red Eye was to see other monsters and their auras, he realized he was the only one with a chance to defeat such a high-level threat. Kazuro warned them not to relax, as the monster might be lurking nearby, ready to attack. Meanwhile, the creature began to descend, crawling closer to the girl by her bed. Pointing at his classmate, Kazuro shouted that there was a monster above her and that everyone needed to leave urgently. His face showed no fear, but the others suspected he was joking. They didn't believe him since they couldn't see the monster, thinking Kazo was merely trying to provoke them. Suzuki remarked that such jokes were too dangerous and cruel, urging him to stop mocking them. The girl standing in the corner, already feeling blamed for what had happened, was deeply unhappy about being ridiculed. She was terrified of monsters and began to feel that she was unwanted. Suddenly, a hand pierced through her thin waist, creating a deep wound in her stomach. The injury was severe and fatal, damaging internal organs and causing shock. Everyone's concern grew as they realized Kazo had not been joking. The girl faced them, fear and shock in her eyes, blood pouring from the gaping hole in her stomach. Suzuki was horrified and stumbled back into her blonde-haired friend, who was equally stunned by the gruesome sight. Lowering her eyes, she noticed the terrible wound on herself. The shock rendered her unable to understand what had happened. She felt utterly alone. The girl began to cry out for help, confused about the situation. The monster wrapped its tongue around her and grabbed her face with sharp claws, devouring her with its gaze, devoid of any pity. The beast was large, with 6 eyes that allowed it to see everything clearly. It tore her into 3 pieces mercilessly and cold-bloodedly. To the others, it appeared as if the girl simply exploded, but Kazuro understood what truly happened. The sight of her lifeless remains terrified the others, who stood bewildered. They realized the monster was invisible and had no idea how to fight such an enemy. Huddled together at the end of the corridor, they wondered what to do. Kazo explained that he could see the monster thanks to the Red Eye skill, urging them to run. Suki felt enraged that the Red Eye should have targeted her, since she was the first to notice it. The bespectacled boy was still too shocked to think clearly, leaving the others at a loss about their next move. Kazo turned around and ran to lure the monster out and kill it alone. The others noticed that the only person who could see the monster began to run away. Beautiful Suki decided to think about what to do, but the bespectacled boy reasoned that this wasn't the time or place. They needed to run, or they would be torn apart by the creature. She was furious with Kazo for mercilessly allowing the monsters to kill and not trying to help. The trio began to chase after Kazo, believing he alone could see the monster. Suzuki thought they had a better chance of defeating the creature if they worked together with Kazuro. Seeing the trio running after him, Kazuro felt uneasy. He was hiding his skills, and if they noticed, it would raise too many questions. With the monster hot on their trail, Kazuro faced a dilemma: keep his secret or save his friends. The monster moved swiftly along the walls, closing in. Kazo ran as fast as he could, hoping to survive. Kazuro glanced back at the creature gaining on them and realized he had to make a decision quickly, otherwise he would die. The speed and agility of the monster were immense. He needed to act with certainty. Suddenly, a monster with a chainsaw spoke in Kazuro's mind, offering to deal with the 6-eyed beast. He felt strong disgust toward the monster and a desire to kill it. The chainsaw craved blood and excitement, restless and eager for action. Kazuro had heard that the chainsaw monster wanted a fight, but he hadn't yet seen an opportunity and was unsure how to proceed. He doubted that the chainsaw would overcome such a foe, but an idea sparked in his mind. They wouldn't be able to run for long, and the monster was still faster. Kazuro resolved to attack. Abruptly, he stopped, preparing to enter the battle using his monsters against such a dangerous six-eyed creature. His classmates, exhausted from their frantic run, shouted at him to keep going. Suki looked at him in surprise, insisting they needed to reach the exit, where the monster wouldn't touch them. Kazuro, having gathered himself, chose not to flee but to fight. Everyone was taken aback by his courage, or perhaps his naive stupidity, in deciding to confront such a monster. They tried to dissuade him. The bespectacled boy and Suzuki thought it wiser to reach the exit than to face an invisible foe. Understanding they wouldn't be able to run much longer, they began to support Keijo, hoping he would win. Realizing they were not as brave as he was, they started to cheer for him. As the monster lunged aggressively at Keijo, ready to tear him to pieces, it extended its tongue and waved it menacingly. The examiner, observing everything through a camera built into his voice, was not the only one watching the children. The headquarters of the monster absorbers, which organized these exams, was monitoring potential candidates for their ranks. Many participants had been killed or severely injured, and board members were horrified by the rising number of casualties. There had been too few worthy absorbers in recent years, leading to great resentment over the exam's poor outcomes. One of the examiners, trying to calm his nerves, lit a cigarette after witnessing the losses among applicants. He turned to a colleague managing Zone A, asking if her candidates had a chance of survival. "My candidates failed the exam in Zone B, but there's hope," replied Yuri, a board member and one of the strongest absorbers. "A guy named Kazuro has a good chance of joining our ranks, but it all depends on whether he survives the battle." They watched on the monitor as Kazuro fought a high-ranking monster, hoping he would prevail. An aggressive face with an open mouth and protruding tongue ferociously approached Kazuro. This green creature looked disgusting, driven solely by a desire to kill as many children as possible. Casting the red-eye binding spell, Keijo prepared for his next move. Everything happened so quickly that the slightest mistake could cost him his life, but the monster managed to dodge, sensing the threat. It decided to attack from behind while Kazuro was trying to process the situation. Realizing he didn't have time, Kazuro pushed the limits of his power, casting another spell. The red-eye hadn't worked on such a fast monster. The creature was almost upon him, extending its massive, sharp-clawed hand. Its speed was astonishing, reminiscent of animal instincts. The others couldn't bear to watch. Understanding that this could be the end for Kazuro, they closed their eyes, resigning themselves to their fate. "Look!" a classmate exclaimed, fear and hope in his eyes. Cleaning his hands from his face, the blond boy noticed what was happening and called out to his classmates. The guys watched as Kazuro summoned a monster whose abilities rivaled those of the invisible creature. The bespectacled boy was surprised and a bit jealous that he hadn't received such a monster. Suzuki clenched her fists, feeling nervous as she observed the unfolding events. Kazuro had used a spell on the busty beauty that affected her brain, freezing her at the last moment. The melody of the busty monster was played on a zither, enhancing its effects. Frozen in a striking pose, the monster could not move, leaving everyone shocked at Kazuro's unexpected power. They wondered where he had obtained such strength, as his school card indicated he had the weakest level and could absorb only one half monster. The blond boy began to suspect that Kazuro had forged his profile. Confused, the bespectacled boy pondered how this was possible. Had Kazuro truly been hiding his powers since entering school? Sweat trickled down his face as he contemplated why Kazuro concealed his potential and strength. Finally, Kazuro unleashed the chainsaw monster to deal with the six-eyed creature, activating it by clicking the saw symbol on his left hand. The entity that emerged from Kazuro's mana was massive and resembled a chainsaw-wielding warrior. The six-eyed monster was frightened, realizing it couldn't withstand such formidable spirits and attempting to flee. As the six-eyed creature struggled, the chainsaw monster closed in, winding up and launching itself to cut the six-eyed monster into pieces. The saw began to slice through the monster, blood splattering everywhere as anguished cries echoed through the hospital corridors.